Okay, so to all of you in the room with us, thank you very much for coming. My name is Brad Skeel. I am the System Center Practice Lead at Vertiva. I'm also a 20-year Microsoft systems engineer and consultant. I've been working with Microsoft Windows Server since NT 3.5, which was a long, long time ago. We're going to talk about today is a product overview of Server 2012. We're going to talk about some specific subsystems of Server 2012 that are what I would consider to be game changers in this next version, and then to delve into the System Center product line, which is very heavily tied into this product as well. One of the things that we'll talk about too at the end is probably, I don't know, do we have the licensing piece in there?
Yep, one slide.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit of licensing because it does change quite a bit in Server 2012, so we want to make sure we kind of cover off on that, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So, just as a show of hands, how many in the room or online have 2012 running today? Even in a lab? Got it booted up in a lab? Nope. Okay. Sounds like we got somebody online that does. Great. This is what I would consider to be I haven't, I've been given this. This is about the third time I've given this presentation. I consider this to be probably the most significant version release of Windows Server since 2000. I don't think I've been as excited about a server release since Windows 2000. This particular product is, it's what I would consider a culmination of a lot of work that Microsoft needed to do to the operating system to make it truly, truly enterprise ready. I think that as we talk about this more and more, you might start to pull the pieces together that what Microsoft did with this version of Windows is really look at and their learnings when they built Windows Azure about how could they make this thing truly scale to a massive size. So one of the things we're going to talk about storage. Storage engine was basically rewritten. We're going to talk about SMB 3.0. SMB is server message block. It's the underpinnings of how Windows moves things around, how you copy files between servers. Then we're going to talk about Hyper-V 3.0, which is Microsoft's virtualization platform. Started in Windows Server 2008. And is currently, and with the release of this, is now version 3.0. And then we're going to talk about some public-private cloud integration and how does this thing fit into the larger ecosystem that you may be thinking about in terms of your plans to do cloud work in your own companies. So. In terms of this presentation, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, stop me. The presentation's meant to be fairly fluid, and I'm totally fine with questions and whatnot. So, in terms of, I also like to get a quick check of hands in terms of virtualization. Is everyone here 50% virtualized in their environment or better? Okay, got a few people online. How about 75%? So, okay, we got a few more. Okay. Good morning. Excellent. Okay. Okay, so in talking about Server 2012, what are the top benefits? Why am I looking at this? Why would I want to be, seriously trying to accelerate my adoption cycle into Server 2012? Really, I mean, the first one certainly is the idea of it being a comprehensive platform for cloud. Um, it was, like I said earlier, it was designed with a lot of learnings that they built, that Microsoft got from when they built the Azure platform. And so it does do an awful lot in terms of seamlessly integrating into the cloud, whether that's Azure, whether that's a public or private cloud infrastructure that you're building. But there's a high degree of flexibility in terms of being able to use this thing and use this operating system in your environment, depending on where you are in your adoption cycle of cloud technologies. We'll talk about this when we get into storage and we talk about SMB and whatnot. And one of the things that I want you to walk away from this is it's highly flexible in how you decide to deploy it. You know, in previous versions of Windows, you really had to think about, well, I've got to have a robust storage platform. I've got to have a whole infrastructure to be able to really manage and take advantage of, say, high availability features and whatnot in Windows. And what you're going to find with this is that, you can kind of just do it. You can do it as simply as, two servers talking to each other over a network, or putting together a full infrastructure. In terms of cost savings, and that gets back to the flexibility piece, because you may decide that you don't want to or can't afford to roll out the full, disk infrastructure and whatnot, but you still want to have some of the high availability features or other pieces that come with the storage platform and whatnot. And so again, cost savings is extremely, has been thought through quite well in this particular version of Windows Server. And then support for the modern work style. I just gave a presentation at MindSurf last week on Thursday about Windows 8. And this server operating system, as well as Windows 8, are very much kind of symbiotically tied together to some degree. Supporting on the back end of the server piece is VDI infrastructure, branch cache, a lot of these technologies that really support a flexible work style. One of the discussion points I had about Windows 8 was Windows 8 is a client operating system that truly is designed to focus on the way people work and be able to, you can deploy it in such a way that really matches well with the way people work, so that so your end users can be maximally productive based on how you roll Windows 8 out. And likewise with the server operating system is the same thing. You can use the different technologies like direct access, VDI, etc., to seamlessly integrate your back-end infrastructure with the client. So whether your end users are using tablets or phones or thin client PCs, ultrabooks, whatever, the idea is that these two halves of this system are designed to make it so that you can deploy the Microsoft infrastructure to make your end users maximally productive. And so you'll see some of that as we go through some of this slide deck as well. So, server capabilities, we have infrastructure, we've got applications, we have clients. All of these things go together to really drive home the idea that, from a server perspective, it's all about making sure that the ecosystem is there for the end user. You want to make sure that there's this concept of data center providers and service consumers. And I gave a presentation earlier this year that really talks about how in the coming years, how the shifting in IT is going to bring those together very tightly. So there will be there'll be a tight coupling between the people providing the service in the data center to the people consuming the service on the business side. And the companies that figure out how to reduce or remove all the friction and make those two sides of the equation extremely tightly coupled will be the ones that succeed. And that's where a lot of these server capabilities come into play, is making those scenarios work very quickly and make them your users productive. The technical capabilities of Windows Server, obviously, virtualization is big. Microsoft obviously is extremely is extremely competitive with VMware right now. When I looked at this version of Hyper-V, I was really surprised to see the number of features that were being included in it. I honestly didn't expect some of this stuff to hit until the version after Server 2012. So the fact that they got into this version so quickly was impressive. And it really does begin to change the virtualization question and equation, in my opinion. Prior to this version of Hyper-V, it was difficult for me to recommend Hyper-V in production. Testing was fine, in less stringent production environments. I felt it wasn't quite ready for prime time, primarily because of the high availability pieces. And that's all been addressed in this version of Server 2012. So it's good to see that. Storage, the storage subsystem has been completely rewritten, from the ground up, which is in order to take advantage of the high availability features that they needed to include in Hyper-V 3.0, the storage subsystem needed to get rewritten. We'll talk some more detail about that, but there's an awful lot of flexibility there. Web and application platform, that's always been a staple of Windows Server, obviously IIS. This would be IIS version 8 now, I believe. And it continues to mature that, that side of the fence. So if you're writing custom .NET applications or deploying web services, this is the other thing that's very, very important, that, in any business today, it's really hard to not, frankly, communicate over web services. Most applications do it. Certainly in the app world, where you have apps running on a tablet, which are lightweight, are usually going to be talking over some kind of web service to a back-end server. This obviously is an important component of that. Networking. Networking was again addressed quite heavily, and it had to be addressed in order to take advantage of the high availability in Hyper-V. Automation and management. That gets into talking about System Center. We'll kind of chat, at the end of this presentation about System Center. But Microsoft also really looked at, how can we make this particular version of Windows very manageable. It's got PowerShell baked into it all over the place. So if you have admins that are used to the command line running their operating systems, the entire thing can be run completely without a graphical user interface. VDI, virtual desktops, again, a major uplift here, because it's a flexible piece of how people work. You may not, you may have certain instances where you don't deploy, phones or laptops or tablets, but have users access a virtual desktop infrastructure. And that's where this comes into play, and it's obviously been made much more robust in this particular version. And then we get to identity and access, and identity really, especially around the Active Directory Federation services. In this, as the cloud world becomes more and more ubiquitous across all of these different technologies, identity management and authentication and security are going to become paramount. And so Microsoft also rewrote heavy portions of the Active Directory infrastructure to accommodate that and make it easy to deploy. ADFS in today's flavor it's easy to deploy. I would argue with people that configuring it can be kind of a challenge. Any questions so far? None? Okay. Storage. So Microsoft had to, again, like I said earlier, in order to really take advantage of the Hyper-V improvements, they really needed to look at rewriting storage. And so they basically, completely looked at it and added a lot of new features. Some of the more important ones in my mind are, the cluster shared volume, certainly SMB 3.0, which we'll talk about. Transparent failover to me is probably the most important. The one thing to remember is that in Hyper-V 2.0, which is the current version running on server 2008 R2, is that the only way you can truly get high availability is you need to have a cluster, Windows cluster system running underneath Hyper-V in order to move the VMs between hosts. And so the idea was, in this particular version, is they wanted to remove that requirement and still make it so that, Windows could, fail over disk volumes between servers if needed. And to me that's just a huge improvement in terms of how things were done before. Offloaded data transfer, this is another piece we're going to talk about, but it comes into how they rewrote the subsystem so that, large data transfers don't require having to, manage that all the way through the operating system stack, but instead keep it at a subsystem near the network interface so that it can perform much faster than having to deal with all the overhead of dealing with the OS itself. So again, kind of a top-down, bottom-up rewrite for this particular piece. Scale enhancements, this gives you a little bit of, this particular slide gives you just a little bit of idea of kind of where things were and with 2008 R2, and then kind of where they're going in 2012 and kind of the performance increase factor. I think, if you look at it, obviously from a memory perspective, it's huge. Processors is huge. Disk size, all of it across the board is at least 2 times, if not better, capacity increase between 2008 R2 and 2012. And so, again, this particular version of Windows really starts to become the big data center player that it's always Microsoft's been pushing in that particular direction. So again, Microsoft's into the cloud. They love the cloud. And 2012 is really about the cloud and optimizing your IT environment, to really fit with that particular piece. It really is, virtualization obviously is an important part of it, but it scales out huge amounts of workload. It allows you to connect to cloud services securely through ADFS and other technologies. It is really designed from the ground up to be that sort of cornerstone of your data center. And so there's a slide that we'll look at later on that was a screenshot from TechEd where it showed, some virtual machine host they were running, and it had 84 terabytes of memory and all this other stuff, and how fast it did all this, and it was pretty impressive. So again, as I said earlier, these really then drive, especially the last one, when you start talking about Windows 8 and how it's designed to help you roll out and maintain and manage a mobile workforce. So if you look at this slide, we've got kind of the, here's the 2 extremes. You got a simple, discrete system. You've got a, you may have a, 1U pancake or pizza box server attached to some disks, and the disks are on board. And then you've got, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got a whole bunch of servers attached to an external disk array, probably redundant fiber with the disk array and whatnot. And so, you've got to figure out, one of the goals of this was to figure out, okay, well, how do we make this all work together? Because, Microsoft has customers in all spectrums, everything from, startups to, Target Corps. And, how do we make all, how does this infrastructure and ecosystem work? And so it really was designed, with a thought of how do we, get, those types of scenarios in place, how do we get, the in-betweens, where we have, cluster nodes talking to a bunch of disks, a JBOD disk array and whatnot. And so all of those things are, manageable and usable in Server 2012. And this table basically, kind of illustrates that across the board, it doesn't make any difference. Server 2012 can figure it out, and you can use these technologies whether you're on a single discrete system or you're on a enterprise an enterprise array. Any questions? Hello? Anyone? So as we get into talking about, we talked about storage, one of the things that I mentioned earlier when we first kind of started talking was the idea of continuous availability. And this was something that truly was a key milestone and a key feature milestone that Microsoft really wanted to include in this particular version of Windows Server. The idea is that it should just work, and you should be able to, connect through SMB and through the storage subsystem disk volumes together and make them fail over transparently and make them continuously available, and your applications don't know any better. And so that becomes an extremely, this was a key element to how, or a key feature element that they wanted included in this version of Windows Server. Obviously in 2008 R2, failovers are not transparent. Even if you're running a cluster, a failover is not transparent. So, you still have an outage as, the resource groups move between cluster nodes and whatnot. Applications have to be written to some degree. If it's a custom application, they need to at least be written in a way to try to reconnect if they lose connectivity to a database system or whatnot. And so, the idea is that you still have to deal with disruption, you still have to deal with a potential loss of data or a potential corruption in your database or application servers as well. In 2012, as I said, we introduced the concept of SMB failover, transparent failover. From the application standpoint, it basically looks seamless. It supports all those particular items there, whether it's a plan move, load balancing, et cetera, et cetera. The whole piece of it basically works, under the covers so that no application will notice a particular outage and whatnot. Some details about SMB transparent failover. It does require, all the elements have to be Windows Server. So if you have a client, you have a server, all of them need to be Windows Server 2012. The way it works is, it's all built into the 2012 subsystem. So if you have, say, a disk share, one disk share running server 2008 R2 and another server running 2012, that particular thing, you won't be able to take advantage of this particular feature. But the idea is that using some of the technologies that they developed, especially in SQL Server around like the database mirroring pieces where they had the witness, service, etc. They've kind of taken those features and pulled them into Windows Server to help manage the failover and manage the allocation of load, etc., etc. So some of the changes in the disk subsystem, obviously making NTFS more resilient to these kind of failures. Marking in the file system itself where checkpoints happen, so that if you fail over, you know where you can pick up on the other side, are all obviously very important. Yes, sir.
By a SMB3L client, would you also mean Windows 8 itself?
Think of the client as the source of those. So you have one server that has, maybe is reading from a disk drive or a volume. So it could be Windows 8 or it could be another Windows 2012 server. The point is it's a client, so it's reading something from another share, and so the server is where the files are that it's trying to get to, and it's serving them up. So,
but as far as the transparent failover support, you said only 2012. It only
yeah.
goes to 2012. But
yeah,
you would assume Windows 8.
Yeah, it includes Windows 8 because Windows 8 has the same pieces built into it. So, storage virtualization. Obviously, this comes into play heavily when we're talking about virtual disks, as and the virtualization subsystem. One of the things what really makes me excited about this is the fact that you could start using, a lower cost disk subsystem, a JBOD, array attached with, a bunch of SAS drives, or, SATA drives or whatnot, but there isn't the need or expense to have to buy a, $40,000 SAN infrastructure to get and use this type of technology. And so what's exciting about it is that it brings some of those more enterprise features down to the mid and small market, assuming that you've kind of pulled it together correctly. Because I'll tell you, buying a JBOD disk enclosure and connecting it is way cheaper than putting in a SAN. And so you wouldn't necessarily get all the niceties of virtualization, disk virtualization and whatnot, and performance that you might get with a SAN, but certainly from the standpoint of cost effectiveness and whatnot, it certainly makes a compelling story. And so yeah, what happens is, and we'll get into kind of talking about storage spaces. Storage spaces are Windows' way of creating sort of virtual disk pools. It's almost basically like Microsoft's creating LUNs. They don't call it LUNs, but that's essentially what they are for, they call it storage spaces, but that's essentially what it is. SMB3 DAS equivalence. DAS is direct attached storage. So some of these slides were kind of lifted from some tech ed decks, but I thought they were kind of cool and they were really illustrated. Nothing illustrates things like bar charts and pie charts and whatnot. And so I wanted to include some of them, so you got a chance to see what graphically some of the performance improvements are in looking at an SMB2 direct attached storage versus SMB3. We are 2008 R2 uses SMB2, so it's a as you can see, it's a pretty significant improvement. And that's using GigE type connectivity versus 4 gig fiber channel as well. But you can achieve these kinds of things over a standard gig E connection as well. So, any questions about that? SMB multi-channel. What this is essentially on the network side of things. So obviously SMB is the underlying protocol for Windows as as it transfers files and transfers data between servers and whatnot. The idea here being that the actual subsystem can look at and use multiple TCP connections as it's needed to move the amount of files. If it's obviously a large multi-gig data file transfer, you want to have as many open as many channels as you can. Something that you didn't really get in 2008 R2. It was kind of basically bottlenecked. Whereas they kind of opened the stopgap here and rewrote all of this and said, oh, well, great, you know what, we'll allow for multi-concurrent connection channels between client and server. So, and again, think of it this way: is the client is just any box that's requesting something from another box, another server that has the files actually hosted on there. Again, makes it easy. It's already, it's assuming that all the pieces are in place. It'll make the configuration and use multiple network paths as needed. So there's nothing you need to do to make that happen. This particular slide really drives into the idea that when making a request from a file and from a client to a server, the traditional way, like I said earlier, the traditional way of controlling and accessing those commands, we're having to go through the entire stack of the operating system. What this slide really illustrates is the idea that all of that disk transfer is now offloaded. And I included it in here because I think it's important to understand that so much of the overhead that gets included in Windows, in the previous versions of Windows, more mundane tasks like network transfers and things like that have now been offloaded, into the subsystem, and basically avoids having to deal with all the overhead of the operating system. Again, really, really forward thinking in terms of how all of that comes together and making it perform far more faster than previous versions. Same thing, data dedupe. This was another thing that was sorely needed and has now been built in, so that you're not dealing with you're basically optimizing your disk as much as possible and deduping the data as much as you need to. Again, when it comes to things like branch cache and some of these other things, it's really important. If I don't need to transfer the data, then don't do it. Storage. Obviously, the iSCSI target is now included in Server 2012. You could download it for 2008 R2. All of those things are already there. NFS. So if you're working with Unix, Linux, is now it's now baked in. It's an NFS server is built into Windows 2012. So if you've got Linux clients that you want to have access to Windows server, you can do that. Certainly also for Macs or other clients, and obviously SMB server as well. So. So what does it mean for you? For folks in IT, what is this all about? To me, it's enterprise class. It's enterprise class virtualization. It's flexible, and It really does alter and you can rethink the ways you would deploy Hyper-V, SQL file servers, application servers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, I think that was, you know, a lot of the goals for this were really to look at how to make this thing more flexible, and then how to make it cost effective across various, you know, across business sectors, you know, from the small to mid all the way to the enterprise. Now we'll talk some about Hyper-V 3.0. So Hyper-V over SMB. So this is the, you know, this is the kind of the culmination of, you know, we talked about SMB 3.0, we talked about the storage improvements. Well, it all really comes together in order to, you know, support Hyper-V 3.0. You know, in terms of transferring, you know, disk I/O over the SMB3 protocol, it can work with standalone servers, clustered servers. It doesn't make any difference. Again, flexibility, ease of management. You know, if you couple this with System Center Virtual Machine Manager, it really does create a complete ecosystem. And we'll talk about Virtual Machine Manager later. But, so, you know, it supports the SMB transparent failover. It supports scale out. It supports the multi-channel piece. It supports, you know, complete PowerShell manageability, et cetera. So these become extremely, again, these features start to now really bring Hyper-V into the, you know, VMware world in terms of high availability and performance and things like that. So on the transparent failover side, you know, in terms of having zero downtime, you know, it can now support, you know, planned failovers if you're